You just tagged my Navy patrol boat. You really think you can get away with that?" I muttered under my breath as I stood there, the salty wind whipping through my hair. My name's Jack Peterson, and this wasn't just any boat. It was a Navy patrol boat, one I had been assigned to protect. But here was Karen, a self-righteous HOA president, using spray paint to deface it like it was some kind of public art project. She had no idea who she was messing with. I had just come back from a mission overseas, expecting peace and quiet, but instead, I found myself dealing with a petty HOA problem that had escalated to a whole new level. It wasn't the kind of thing I usually dealt with, but sometimes life throws curveballs, and I wasn't about to let someone walk all over me, especially not someone like Karen. Standing on the docks, looking at the mess she'd left behind, I realized something. Karen thought she could do whatever she wanted, that her HOA position gave her power over everything, but she didn't know who I was. She didn't know that I wasn't just some civilian living here. I had a lot more pull than she thought. And right then, I decided to take action. I wasn't just going to let this slide. I wasn't about to let some entitled Karen destroy my property, my pride, or my service. I didn't act out of anger. Though, believe me, I was furious, but out of necessity. I knew that the law was on my side, and this was going to end in a way she would never see coming. I went back to my truck, pulling out my phone to call a few people. The look on Karen's face when she realized who I really was going to be priceless. It only took minutes for the shore patrol officers to be on their way. In just a short time, they would be knocking on Karen's door. As I walked away from the boat, I couldn't help but smile. She thought she was untouchable, just because she had power in her little HOA world. But that was the thing about power. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to flaunt itself. It simply acts. And that's exactly what I was going to do. It was only a few minutes before the shore patrol. Officers arrived, but it felt like hours. As I waited outside my truck, the weight of the situation started to settle in. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel felt louder than usual. Karen had no idea what was coming. I could almost picture her sitting in her living room, sipping coffee, thinking she had the upper hand. She didn't realize yet that her little HOA authority didn't mean a thing when it came up against the kind of power I had at my disposal. I ran my hand through my hair, trying to calm myself. As a Navy officer, I'd dealt with much more intense situations, but this was personal. This was someone messing with my property. The patrol car pulled into the neighborhood just as I saw Karen's house coming into view. I was right. There she was, standing at her front door, looking out, still clueless about what was about to happen. I didn't rush. There was no need for it. I watched the officers as they parked, stepping out of the car with their uniforms crisp and their stances confident. These were men and women who were used to authority. They were used to giving orders, not taking them. But Karen, she didn't know that. The officers walked toward her house with the calm assurance that comes with knowing you're in the right. By the time they reached her door, Karen had already noticed them, her expression shifting from curiosity to irritation. She had no idea who they were, but the look on her face when they introduced themselves was priceless. The lead officer spoke first, his voice firm yet polite. "Ma'am, we've received a report about damage to a military asset in the neighborhood. We need to discuss an incident involving a Navy patrol boat." Karen's face turned pale. I could see her trying to process the situation, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. She tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear she was panicking inside. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, feigning innocence. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't flinch. "We have a report stating otherwise. We're going to need to take a look at the damage and discuss how it happened." Karen shifted uncomfortably on her feet. She glanced over her shoulder, no doubt looking for some way to escape the situation, but the officers weren't going anywhere. She had no choice now but to face the consequences of her actions. I stood back, watching it all unfold from a distance. It wasn't until I saw Karen's face fall that I realized just how satisfying this moment would be. It wasn't just about the boat, though. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about showing her that, despite her position in the neighborhood, she couldn't just do whatever she wanted without facing the consequences. This was the law speaking. This was the power of authority that Karen had so recklessly underestimated. The officers had everything they needed. They were calm, methodical, and sure of themselves. Karen, on the other hand, had no idea what she was about to face. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I watched her try to explain herself, knowing full well that her excuses weren't going to save her this time. As I watched Karen stand there, trying to talk her way out of the situation, I could see the panic setting in. Her usual confidence was slipping, replaced with desperation. She had no idea how deep she had dug herself into this hole. The shore patrol officers were calm, professional, but I could sense the undercurrent of amusement in their voices as they exchanged glances. They dealt with enough entitled people to know exactly what was happening here. Karen, though, had no clue what she was up against. I could hear her voice rising, her attempts to justify her actions. This is absurd. I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood nice. That boat was a mess anyway. It needed to be cleaned up, she said, waving her hand dismissively as though that somehow made it better. But the officers weren't buying it. They had all the evidence they needed, and they weren't about to let her talk her way out of it. The lead officer turned to her, his voice now more serious. Ma'am, you're going to need to come with us. This is a federal matter now. Damaging a military asset like that is a criminal offense. You're looking at serious consequences. The words hit Karen like a ton of bricks. I watched as her face went from anger to disbelief, then to something I could only describe as fear. She stammered, trying to come up with something else to say, but it was too late. The damage was done. I'd been holding my breath this whole time, but now I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about the boat anymore. It was about the principle. She had thought she could take advantage of a situation because of her position, but she was learning the hard way that some things were just off limits. The officers placed her in handcuffs, her protests falling on deaf ears. She looked at me one last time, her eyes full of disbelief, but I didn't feel sorry for her. She had crossed a line, and now she was going to pay for it. As they led her to the patrol car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice, a quiet satisfaction that things had played out the way they were supposed to. Karen had learned that power wasn't something you flaunted, it was something you respected. And for the first time, I was the one in control. It wasn't long before I heard the sound of the patrol car pulling away, Karen in the back, her protests fading as the distance grew. The officers had done their job, and they were leaving with her in custody, but I stayed for a few moments, standing in the quiet street, letting the reality of the situation sink in. I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. It had been a strange kind of victory, but it felt right. The neighborhood felt eerily silent without Karen's constant presence, her power trips, her self-important attitude. It was as if the weight she had imposed on the whole block had been lifted. The HOA president, who had once wielded her influence like a weapon, was now facing the consequences of her actions. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, watching the last of the patrol car's taillights disappear down the road. It was hard to believe how quickly it had all unfolded. 1 minute, Karen thought she could get away with tagging a Navy patrol boat, and the next, she was facing federal charges. But the truth was, it wasn't really about the boat anymore. It was about holding people accountable for their actions. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could do whatever they wanted without facing the consequences. I took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs, and for the first time in days, I felt at peace. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me back to reality. It was a message from one of my fellow officers, a friend of mine from base. He had heard what happened and wanted to check in. I smiled, quickly typing a reply to let him know everything was taken care of. The truth was, I wasn't just proud of how it had all gone down. I was relieved. The whole situation had been a mess from the start. I had known I had the power to fix it, but it was still a relief to see it unfold the way it had. As I slid my phone back into my pocket, I glanced up at the darkening sky, the first stars starting to appear. It was the kind of night that made you feel small, yet somehow significant, like everything in the world had aligned just right. I knew this wasn't over for Karen. She would face the full weight of the law for her actions, and that was a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. But for now, I was content. I had done what was right, and that was enough. The boat would be cleaned up, the neighborhood would move on, and life would return to normal. At least for me, it would. I knew Karen would be a long time before she could say the same. The next few days passed in a blur. The neighborhood felt different, quieter somehow. There was a certain peace that settled over the area, and I could sense it in the way people carried themselves. It was as though they had been waiting for someone to stand up to Karen, and now that I had, Things were beginning to return to normal. My phone rang again, this time from my sister, Sarah. She had heard about what happened and was, of course, concerned. "Jack, are you okay? I saw the news about Karen. You know, it's crazy that it had to go that far." I chuckled, shaking my head. "I'm fine, Sarah. Really, just had to do what needed to be done. It's over now." Sarah's voice was filled with relief, but also a bit of disbelief. "I just can't believe she thought she could get away with something like that. I mean, a Navy patrol boat? Who does that?" I agreed with her, but in the back of my mind, I realized it wasn't just about the boat. It was about what Karen represented. She had been so caught up in her own sense of power, using her position as HOA president to manipulate people, that she thought she could do whatever she wanted with no consequences. And that's the kind of behavior I couldn't let slide. I hadn't realized how much of a weight that situation had been until it was over. Now, I could focus on what mattered: my work, my family, my friends. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had some clarity. As the days went on, I saw a few more neighbors stop by and give me a nod of approval, a simple thank you for putting an end to the chaos Karen had stirred up. It was quiet now, the kind of peace that only comes after a storm has passed. But deep down, I knew that what had happened with Karen wasn't just about a small-town HOA drama. It was a reminder of why it's important to stand up for what's right, no matter how small the issue may seem. There are people out there who will try to push others around, thinking they can do whatever they want because they hold a little bit of power. But in the end, that power is nothing without accountability. I had learned that lesson long before this, and now I was putting it into practice. As I stood outside, looking at the still waters of the lake, I realized that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone. And that was okay. I had done what I needed to do, and now it was time to move on. Karen would face the consequences of her actions, and I could go back to living my life, knowing I had made a difference. It had been a week since Karen had been taken away in that patrol car, and life was slowly returning to normal. The neighborhood, once tense and filled with the chaos Karen had left behind, now seemed to breathe easier. There was a certain calm that had settled over the area, a peace that had been long overdue. As I walked down the street, I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me, but this time, it wasn't the usual judgment. It was more of a silent acknowledgement, a respect I hadn't realized I had earned. It felt good. The wind was crisp, the sky clear, and as I made my way back to my truck, I noticed the familiar sights: the old oak tree where I used to carve my initials as a kid, the quiet houses with their well-kept lawns. It was a good place to call home. I had barely gotten into my truck when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my friend, Mike, who was still stationed at the base. "Just heard about Karen. Nice work. You handled that like a pro." I smiled, typing back, "Thanks, Mike." It wasn't exactly a mission, but it had to be done. I paused for a moment, looking out at the street, thinking about how strange the whole situation had been. I hadn't expected things to go down the way they did. I had been frustrated, sure, but when I saw Karen being led away, I realized how much I had been holding back, how much that entire situation had been weighing on me. It wasn't just about the boat. It was about standing up for what's right. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had done just that. As the days passed, I began to hear more about Karen's legal troubles. The neighborhood chatter was filled with stories of how she was trying to fight the charges, but the evidence was stacked against her. People were talking about how they'd seen her around, giving orders like she was untouchable, thinking her position gave her the right to control everything. But now, everyone knew better. I had watched as she pushed and pushed, thinking she could get away with it. And in the end, I had been the one to stop her. That sense of justice, it wasn't loud, but it was powerful. It didn't need to be flashy or dramatic. It just needed to be. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was clear, and for the first time in what felt like a long time, I felt like I could breathe. It was a simple moment, but it felt important. It felt like the beginning of something new. There was still a lot of work to do, a lot of days ahead, but for now, everything was right. I had stood up for what was right, and the weight of that felt like a weight lifted. I wasn't sure where the future would take me, but I knew one thing. I could face it, knowing I had done the right thing. The days continued to drift by, and the ripple effect of what had happened with Karen started to fade, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in me. I had done something that was needed, something that hadn't been easy, and yet, It was a moment of clarity in the chaos. I found myself reflecting more than usual, especially when I returned to my work at the base. The routine that had once been so familiar now seemed a little different. It was as if I had learned something about standing firm in the face of adversity. Karen's absence left a space, but in its place, I started to notice a change in the people around me. There was a subtle shift in the way the neighbors interacted with each other, a new sense of mutual respect. I began running into familiar faces at the grocery store or on the walking trail, and it wasn't just small talk anymore. People were talking more openly, more honestly, as if the weight of Karen's power had been lifted and they could finally breathe. I even had a couple of neighbors come up to me and thank me. They didn't know the full story, but they knew enough. They knew what Karen had done, and they recognized the role I had played in putting an end to it. It felt strange at first, hearing those words of appreciation. I wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially for something like this. But over time, I realized that sometimes the quiet actions speak the loudest. It wasn't about fame or accolades. It was about doing the right thing when no one else would. The weight of that responsibility had been heavy, but it had also been freeing. I started to get back to the things that truly mattered. My boat, which had been temporarily out of commission after Karen's little stunt, was finally back in the water. The sound of the engine starting up, the gentle hum of the water as I sailed across the lake, reminded me of the peace I had been searching for. There was something about being out on the water that allowed me to disconnect from everything. It was where I could think clearly, where the world seemed to fall into place. And yet, there was still a part of me that kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting some kind of fallout from what had happened. But as the days passed, I realized there would be no more consequences for me. Karen had to deal with her actions, and I had done what I needed to do. It was done. I spent more time with my family, something I had neglected in the whirlwind of the last few months. The quiet moments around the dinner table, the small talk, the laughter, those were the things that mattered most. I had always known that family came first, but it had taken this whole ordeal to truly appreciate what I had in front of me. One evening, as we sat outside on the porch, my niece, Emma, looked up at me with those wide eyes, her innocent curiosity filling the air. "Uncle Jack, do you ever get scared?" she asked, her voice soft. I looked at her for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened, the challenges I had faced. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "but you have to do what's right, even if it's scary. That's what makes you stronger." She nodded, her face serious for someone so young. It was moments like that, those small exchanges, that made me realize the impact of my actions. I had done more than just stand up to Karen. I had set an example for my family, for those around me. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest thing I could do. As the weeks passed, life seemed to settle back into a comfortable routine. The initial buzz of Karen's departure faded, but there was something about it that lingered. It wasn't just the relief that came from seeing the neighborhood breathe easier, but the sense of change that it had brought to me. I had always prided myself on keeping a low profile, on staying out of trouble, but this whole experience had changed that. I'd learned that sometimes standing up for what's right meant stepping into the spotlight, even if you didn't want to. I was beginning to understand the responsibility that came with having the ability to make a difference. It wasn't something I had ever considered before, but it was something I couldn't ignore now. I found myself thinking more about what kind of example I wanted to set, not just for my family, but for everyone around me. On the surface, everything looked the same. The boats still glided across the water, the sound of the waves was as soothing as ever, and the sunsets over the lake still painted the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. But underneath it all, I was different. I couldn't help but feel more connected to the people around me. The simple moments, like sharing a drink with an old friend or chatting with a neighbor, held more weight now. They meant something. I had a new understanding of the power of community, of standing together, and of how one action, no matter how small, could ripple out and affect everything around it. One evening, I sat on my porch, the cool breeze rustling through the trees. My sister, Sarah, was visiting, and we were talking about everything that had happened. "You know, Jack, I've been thinking," she said, pausing to take a sip of her drink. "I always thought of you as the quiet one, the one who kept his head down and stayed out of trouble. But now, after everything that happened with Karen, I see you differently. You're a lot stronger than you let on." I smiled, a little surprised by her words. "I don't know about all that." I just did what needed to be done. It wasn't about being strong. It was about doing what was right. She looked at me, her eyes soft with understanding. I think that's what makes you stronger. You didn't back down when it mattered. And you didn't let someone walk all over you, even though you could have. Her words stuck with me long after she left. It wasn't just about the situation with Karen. It was about the bigger picture. I had found a part of myself I didn't know existed, a part that was willing to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. The next morning, I decided to take the boat out again. The weather was perfect, clear skies, calm waters, just the right amount of wind to make the sail smooth. As I navigated the boat across the water, the sense of peace that had eluded me for so long began to settle in again. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The actions I'd taken had already spoken for themselves. But I realized that the real work wasn't done with Karen. It was in how I chose to live from here on out. How I would continue to make the right choices, stand by my beliefs, and lead by example, no matter how small or large the challenge. The boat cut through the water with ease, and I felt the weight of the past few months lift off my shoulders. For the first time in a while, I was at peace with where I was and where I was going. It had been a few months since the dust settled, and life had returned to its usual rhythm. The boat was still in the water, the wind was still the same, and the sun still set over the lake every evening. But now, there was a certain clarity to it all. Things felt balanced in a way they hadn't before. I spent my days doing what I loved, and my nights with the people I cared about. The quiet moments had become even more meaningful, and I found myself appreciating the little things more than ever. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cold drink in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant colors, I reflected on how much had changed. Not just in the neighborhood, but in me. The person I had been before the whole ordeal with Karen seemed so distant now. I had learned a lot about myself in the past few months. I had learned that standing up for what's right sometimes means standing alone. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. That was something I had never fully understood until now. I thought back to the days when Karen had ruled the neighborhood, when her presence loomed over everyone like a shadow. I remembered the fear she instilled in people, the way they tiptoed around her, trying not to make waves. But now, that fear was gone. People were walking taller, talking more openly, and there was a sense of freedom in the air. It was as if her absence had given everyone the space to breathe again. And that felt good. The neighborhood had changed, yes, but I had changed too. I had become someone who didn't just back down when faced with injustice, but someone who took action. That lesson was one I would carry with me for the rest of my life. I was interrupted from my thoughts when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. It was Mike, one of my old buddies from the base. He had been keeping in touch, and we hadn't seen each other in a while. "Hey man," he called out, smiling as he made his way up the driveway. "I heard about the whole Karen situation. You really put her in her place, huh?" I laughed, standing up to greet him. "Yeah, I guess you could say that," I said, clapping him on the back. "It wasn't easy, but it had to be done." He raised an eyebrow. "I think you did more than just take care of Karen. You showed everyone in this neighborhood what it means to stand up for what's right." His words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't something I had consciously set out to do, but looking back, I realized he was right. I hadn't just stopped Karen. I had set an example for everyone around me. "Well," I said, leaning back in my chair, "I guess sometimes doing the right thing just feels like the only choice." Mike nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And sometimes," he said, "doing the right thing changes everything." I smiled, knowing he was right. I wasn't just living my life anymore. I was making it count. And as I watched the last of the daylight fade into night, I knew that this chapter in my life had been about much more than just taking down Karen. It had been about finding my place in the world and understanding the power of doing what's right, no matter the cost. And as the stars began to fill the sky, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that I had made a difference, even if it was in a small way.